August 13th, 2018, Planning Commission meeting. We're going to call this meeting to order. Second item on the agenda is to consider approval of the Planning Commission meeting minutes of July 9th, 2018. I'd entertain a motion.
I'll move to approve.
I have a motion by Jensen. Is there a second?
I have one correction.
Okay. Would you like to make a second? And then we'll.
I can make the second
Okay.
with a correction.
All right. And what do you have?
Under item 10, at the very end there, it says motion by Bartlett, second by Bartlett. I'm guessing he didn't second his own motion. So I'm thinking, just for the record, it might have been me that was the second on that, and just got the Barman and the Bartlett mixed up. So if you want to write me in as the second on that,
Okay.
item 10.
All right, so we'll approve the minutes as amended. Any other questions or comments?
One more correction, I was not here.
You weren't here? How's that?
I was in an architectural class,
Oh,
my last one.
okay. Anything else? Okay, so we'll approve the amendment, the amended version of the minutes with those two changes. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? None opposed, that carries. Thank you. We have council representative report, and I can give that this evening. We had several items that were on the last city council meeting. Resolution 139 was the approval of the conditional use permit for Ron Grosso out at 300 Business Park Way. We also approved the R-140, which was the extraterritorial jurisdiction for Shelby Hoops out on Skyline Drive. Resolution 141 was the extraterritorial jurisdiction for Tim Thorson at 810 Highway 51. Resolution 142 was lifting the demo moratorium at 193 West Main Street. And ordinance 143 was a CSM approval out on North Page Street. And this week's city council meeting will be Wednesday night instead of Tuesday night because of the election. And we have one item on there, and that's ordinance 21 of 2018, which is the zoning on North Page Street. And that'll be up for a second reading at the city council meeting. That's all I have. We have staff report. Rodney?
Contained in your packet is the monthly report. I think it's just interesting to note that we're very consistent to last year's year-to-date totals. The number of single-family homes, even the number of commercial starts that we've had year-to-date and through July, both of 17 and 18, numbers are very consistent, which I think is very solid. So if you've got any questions about a particular project, I'd certainly try to answer it for you.
Okay. Item number 5 is a request by Gary and Nancy Dvorak for extraterritorial jurisdiction land division CSM approval to split the parcel at 1471 US Highway 51 into 3 separate parcels in the town of Rutland.
Just to give you an orientation of this particular parcel, Highway 51 is on the right-hand side of the page here. Roby Road, Deer Point, is just about the top of the page location. That intersects with Oak Opening Drive. Oak Opening Drive on the southern edge here is the connection where it will connect with Kettle Park West at the point to the south. These 3 lots are currently in the town of Rutland. They're proposed to be split to create the 3 parcels. It does dedicate the Oak Opening Drive through that parcel, and staff recommends support of the CSM request.
So we'd be looking for a motion. A motion by Robinson and a second by Jensen. And then the Dvoraks are here. If you have any questions for them, they're welcome to come up to the podium. Commissioner Barman?
You can go. No, I was.
Oh,
My question is just about the setback that's going to be created on Lot 3 for the greenhouse building. It looks like it's 16 foot along that new property line. I'm assuming that that's going to meet kind of what the code would be for that particular location, because it looks like we've jogged the property line over closer to that building rather than just going straight up.
I'd defer to that to Gary. I mean, that's certainly a question for the town and the county, because that parcel's not in the city limits.
correct.
So it wouldn't pertain to our setback standards.
I got you.
Did you want to comment on that, Gary?
We just did that because that'll always be open as a drive, that's what we use it for, to get in and out of the greenhouse. We're not gonna currently do anything different with the lot, we're just doing this for refinance purposes, mainly because the road separates our storage units. And so our bank kind of said, hey, you guys should get this, separated.
Separate out.
And that's why we're doing it. It's, the county setback limits are 10 feet.
Okay,
That's, so that's why we're about 16 feet.
that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions or comments for that one? Otherwise, there is a motion and a second. All in favor of the recommendation, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None opposed, that carries. Thank you. Item number 6 is a request by Araya Yellowbird for front facade improvements within the downtown design overlay zoning district at 208 West Main Street. And you might recall that's the old Packer Place. It's currently being operated as a restaurant, 51 South. Rodney?
I think the applicants are here, so you certainly can talk to them. But as you know, the Downtown Design Overlay District has some Planning Commission review authority related to colors in the downtown district. 3 options by the applicant are included in your packet. As I understand it, option 1 is the preferred option at this point. But certainly you can have some dialogue about that and with the applicant if you'd like.
Our Commissioner Barman?
I would like to have a couple questions, so I don't know if.
Sure. Come on up, Araya.
Hi.
You can just kind of speak into the mic if you can, so they can
Okay.
hear you.
You can pull it down.
Yeah.
All right.
My question is primarily, I just want to make sure that I'm seeing the colors, because these aren't the actual swatches, these are a reproduction.
Yeah, the color that you have does not look anything
It looks
like
very blue.
Yeah, it's very
s-
blue and
So I didn't
blue.
know if you brought the swatches with you?
I did not. He has the only ones that I
Okay.
have.
And so, what we're seeing here under option 1 in the palette,
Mm-hmm.
it's not this blue, it's more of, you said, an olive
Yeah.
color. Okay. And how dark is this other trim?
It's kind of like a chocolate brown. Like
Chocolate
it's
brown?
a pretty it's a deeper, I don't know, kind of similar to your guys' nameplates.
Okay, all right,
A milk chocolate,
all right.
not a dark chocolate.
It'd be closer to that,
Okay.
I
Okay.
would guess.
All right. And just another question related to the colors. Have you settled on your own logo colors and your branding? Because I'm wondering if option 1 is closer to the colors you're using for your branding in terms of your signage and your identification of the business? Or are all these compatible with that?
The reason, so I wanted to do green because we have kind of like a healthier menu and it kind of shows people that we have fresh food and everything. And the reason that I included the other 2 options is because you said that in the design overlay proposal form that green is not allowed. So I was thinking that leaves me with orange, purple, and shades of brown. So I included those, but I would just prefer the green. But
Okay.
our logo, as of right now, it's just a black and white.
Thank you. Is that the part of the code that says no primary colors, like blue, red, green, yellow? Is that where you-
Yes.
Okay. I don't know if that would apply to an olive. I think it's
Okay,
just.
yeah, it's not a bright green.
Okay.
It's kind of a muted.
If it's,
I ask
is that pretty
something?
close, what's
Yeah.
being projected?
Yeah, and I can go lighter on the brown if you wanted, and I'd even be open to not doing the, because I kind of made it with color blocks where like the cream color is in all the square parts of it, and I could make it all one color if that's what you would rather have, like the way it is now. I did try to color match the color that it is, because they told me that I could get a fresh coat on it if it was the same, and the wood is rotted, it's chipped, it's faded. I'm assuming it was at one point Packer green because it was a Packer bar, and it's nowhere near that now. And trying to get a sample of that was pretty much impossible. I mean, it's dirty and it's faded and it's chipped, and I did try. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments or motions?
Just, I guess, a question on clarification. Are we then to move on one of these particular options, or are we to say that we approve any of the three? I mean, how, when there's three options presented here, I wasn't sure exactly how the commission,
I would think that would be your pleasure. I mean, you
okay.
know, I guess you could choose one of the three or all three, or two of the three for that matter, or none.
Seems like Matt had something to say.
Did you have something, Matt?
What is the applicant looking for?
I would like the green color.
Option one?
Yeah, option one.
Okay.
The other two were more, I was just trying to provide you with choices that were within the specified guidelines.
Okay.
Well, I'll make a motion to go ahead and approve option one.
Okay. There's a motion by Robinson for option one. Stacy, a second by Alder Jensen. Any more discussion on it? Commissioner Seltzer?
Just wondered if that green is similar to the attorney's shirt? Is that, would you say?
No, I would say his is more of a teal. If I were to compare it to anything, I would say it's a slightly lighter version of the large building across the street from us, the department company.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty close to that.
And I had Alderperson Caravello.
I'm wondering, since I'm looking at the illustrations in here, are you gonna take down the awning?
The awning is already gone,
Oh, it's already gone.
and I was not the one to take it down.
Okay,
That was done by Iron Tortilla.
okay.
Yeah.
Never mind then. I'm looking at this old picture here. There's also actually, I guess on a maybe associated note, on the photograph of that building I'm looking at here, there's like an oval, there's a sign mount that looks like it's sticking out of the second floor.
Yes.
Is that still there?
The metal part is, there's nothing in it, so I was hoping to eventually put our signage in that, but as I understand it, that is for another meeting.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Any
Thanks.
opposed? None opposed, you're good to go.
I can, okay.
Thanks a lot. All right, item number 7 is a request by DAC Print LLC for approval of a landscaping plan, as is a condition of the approved resolution R2 2017 at 305/315 East Main Street. And who wants to start?
I think you summarized it. Really, this is to satisfy one of the conditions of the approval. The demolition was approved with the condition of acting on the landscaping plan related to this site. The applicant has requested that the site be, as you can see in the packet, they're planning a vacant site with grass. It might be worthwhile to highlight the physical size of this parcel is about 2,600 square feet total. I believe it's 56 by 44. Again, the demolition has been approved with the condition that the landscaping plan be acted upon. And so this is the parcel in which that structure now resides.
Okay, any questions, comments, or motions?
Make a motion to approve?
There's a motion by Jensen. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Seltzer. Any discussion? Commissioner Barman?
I would just like to make a few comments. Number one is that I do understand that landscaping is not typically required within the downtown, as was laid out in our introduction to this particular agenda item. But it was a condition of the approval to demolition the building, or to demolish the building. And at that time, demolition was tied to, and I was at the particular meeting, and at the council, or at the commission meetings after that, the landscape plan was presented as being an improvement or a better economic situation than the current building. And so there was a lot of importance placed upon this particular landscape plan. And while it's not required as part of the ordinance, it was required as part of the motion to approve the demolition. And so I think this is important to actually evaluate this particular landscape plan. And it was actually specified that this was supposed to be a detailed landscape plan. And I'm honestly a little bit insulted by a one-sentence statement saying it's going to be all grass. and having this be considered a detailed landscape plan. We also, as commission members, are supposed to be looking at this within the context of the intent of the downtown overlay. And I would like to draw attention to a few things within the overlay, which is in place now. I know, and understanding the next agenda item is talking about revisions, but I'm going back to what is currently on the books, which is what we're supposed to act on, is what's in place. And when you talk about the intent of this particular district, there's references made to the design guidelines. And within the design guidelines, it talks about guidelines for setbacks. And I'll just use this as one example of how you can evaluate a landscape plan for details. It says this guideline for setbacks is, it's intended for facades along the sidewalk edge, but it says this guideline also pertains to parking lots and unbuilt areas. The edge of the sidewalk should be emphasized with some visible barrier, such as a decorative wall or planting, so that the setback is recognized. And so, that's the kind of, that's just one small aspect of a landscape plan detail that accentuates the zero setback component to the downtown district, which you're not going to have if it's just grass from sidewalk to sidewalk. You have no edge. And as I will argue, to be consistent, when the proposal for just doing grass sidewalk to sidewalk was originally presented, to me, a grass lot is not in the economic interest of a historic commercial district. And there's a lot of research that shows that when you have interruptions like that in the street wall or in the facade, the sequence of facades, that's actually a negative economic situation, unless you have a high quality pocket park or green space or something along that lines that becomes an activated space. So, those are concerns that I have about this particular proposal.
Okay, thank you. Any questions or anybody want to comment on that? Or Attorney Dragney, are you following his initial statement about the grass and the consistency with the approved motion from 2017?
I'm listening, yep.
Any questions or comments about that, or?
I think the regulations are very difficult to work with. For example, I'm looking at section 78.517 sub 2, which says the regulations of this section shall apply to all portions of any structure that are visible from any public street right-of-way. Does that mean that they apply only to structures? It's not so clear. There are other elements of this. The standards, the only standards that I can see in the Downtown Design Overlay Zoning District are that you are to base your determination on sound land use, urban design, and economic revitalization principles, or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so I think, unfortunately, you're given a difficult ordinance to work with. This has been a struggle from day one on this one, and it's still not easy. Mm-hmm. I can't give you any magic answers to whether you're right about exactly what you're saying or not. It's a difficult ordinance.
Yeah. Well, and I understand the way that the ordinance is written is not as clear on demolition as we would like, which is why we're going through the process that we have. But I'm going to go back to the original meeting minutes from April 10th, which is when the demolition was approved. And it was approved with the amendment that it requires the applicant to attain approval of a detailed site plan prior to issuance of the demolition permit. And this, to me, a sentence saying it's going to be grass is not a detailed site plan, for one. I'm a landscape architect. That's not what we do. That's not what you should be doing for detailed site plans. But I will agree with you that when you start looking at then what should be considered as being the ideal of a detailed landscape plan, then it just gets back to the original request here that we evaluate. Let me get this right. Focus on the sound aesthetic, land use, site design, and economic revitalization practices. Okay, so with all we're presented with is it will be grass. then when I look at evaluating sound aesthetic, land use, site design, and economic revitalization practices, and I know the burden of proof is now on us as a commission, but I'm a 20-year professional who has worked within economic revitalization field for 20 years within local, state, and national Main Street movement efforts. And everything within those 20 years has always talked about sound economic revitalization practices involves having not only the zero setback that I referenced within Stoughton zone guidelines, but it talks about the importance of having spaces that don't become dead spaces, that don't interrupt interest along the sidewalk. And I think it would be hard to argue that there's going to be interest provided by grass. And so there's nothing there that is going to carry people past or get people to walk more of the district. And research shows, and I brought a book, Call Them All, if you want evidence, Call Them All, written by Paco Underhill, who is a environmental psychologist who studies consumer spaces. And he talks about the importance of dealing with those spaces that interrupt flow of traffic, which that is. And grass is not an answer that would be qualified as a sound economic revitalization practice or even sound site design. So that's my opinion as a commissioner.
I guess I'm trying to figure out what we have on this original landscape concept. Is that no longer a valid concept? Are we just grass now and there's nothing?
That picture in there is going to be deceiving because that's not even on the table anymore.
It's not
It's
on the
grass from sidewalk to sidewalk. That's what they're proposing as their detailed landscape plan, not the picture that's provided in our materials.
I mean, why we even included the picture then, unless you put an X to it. I mean, really.
I think it was included as part of the previous
The
resolution
original.
from back then, so you had all the material.
Well, and just as a, I think, point of history, I think it was, that picture is one of the reasons that the commission at that time approved demolition, because they saw this as being an economic improvement. And you can go back and look at the discussion. They saw a landscape plan like that as being an improvement, but they said there's just not enough details there on dimensions and on plant
what's
species and
included
everything
in the
else.
landscape.
So the intention was that they would come back, and plus the issue, which is, I think, a mute issue from a legal perspective of whether or not, at the time, it was presented that this would become a public park, okay? And that confused the issue at that time. So they wanted to have not only the detailed landscape plan address the details of that picture, but address the issues related to whether or not this actually was becoming a public space versus a private space, because that picture implies public use of the space.
Yeah, it does.
And so that whole issue came into play.
And so it's my understanding that the applicant has now indicated I don't know if it's in writing or not, but they're no longer seeking to use it as a public space, that it's purely a private vacant lot is their proposed use.
I would ask one additional question of the owners. I know with the way we're looking at it, I know this is looking future in terms of the ordinance rewrite, but one of the things that I think the commission was really interested in, particularly as you're looking at vacant lots and just grass lots, is the intention to develop in the future. And I think in the written materials here, it even mentions that that comes up again, is the potential somewhere down in the future to develop on this particular parcel. So I guess I'd like to hear from you guys if there's ever any intention to look at this parcel for infill development, whether your intention is to keep this grass as far as you can see in the future, or where you stand along those lines.
We're not developing.
Okay. So I know one of our, as we look to rewrite the ordinance, one of the things that the commission has been really stressful of is that when a building comes down, is that property owners enter into a development agreement with the municipality in order for the municipality to approve such demolition. Now, that's not in place. But I know that's
Was the original.
that is the intent. So we're kind of caught in that in-between time where that's not really on the table anymore. I want you guys to understand that that's, even though we're considering that and talking about that as a requirement of the rewrites, that's not in place now. We don't have a requirement for a development agreement, and they've said that they are not interested in ever developing it.
Alderperson Carvello?
I may be mistaken, but hopefully I'm not. At the last council meeting, I thought that the demolition moratorium was brought up on this particular parcel, looking at it as that it was going to be, we were going back and looking at that park. I didn't think the understanding at that time that it was just going to be grass. Was that?
Are you asking, or?
Well, I'm looking at Sid, or I guess I'm looking at, I thought that that it was mentioned that there would be like a statue or like a welcoming area to Stoughton at that intersection. I don't know if that was from you guys or if that was just general discussion amongst the council and not directly from the property owners. Sid?
You asked me, so I can respond, I think. What happened is that the Kittlesons, and I've talked to...
Can you come up, Sid?
I've talked to them a number of times, and they presented a plan early, and they were pretty much shot down because the public use part of it was not acceptable. It wasn't acceptable to be a park. So I think they're trying to find out some way that they can tear the building down and have it a usable space. And I think that the way they are coming to it tonight is that this, having a grass would be more acceptable than having it turn into a public space, because there was some thought that that was not going to work. And a lot of that was based on an opinion of a previous opinion of our city attorney, who said that it probably, at least this is what I got from the Kittlesons, is that that wasn't going to be possible. So they are essentially stuck between a rock and a hard place. They can't make it a public setting, much like what that picture shows, and now it sounds like it's going to be difficult for them to make it into simply grass. I think they're stuck, and part of my intention to get this going was for their sake, but not only that, but for the city's sake, because we've got a moratorium that prevented them from doing pretty much anything with it. I think they're stuck not knowing what this commission is going to be, what's going to be acceptable to them, and I think that that's a shame. I think it hurts because they're not quite sure what they can do at this point. I mean, now I'm not speaking for them; they can speak for themselves. But I know the frustration that they're having with this whole situation, and it's like one step forward and a couple of steps back, and one step forward, a couple of steps back for them, and that's where they're at right now, I think. So my intention was to help them at least get beyond the we can do nothing because we have the moratorium.
Yeah, I think your intent was, from what I got from it, was to just remove a building that is not repairing itself on a daily basis.
My thought was that the absence of that building is probably going to be more aesthetically pleasing no matter what it turns out to be, whether it's a sort of public setting or whatever, because the place needs to come down. It's not safe, it's not secure, it's just not pretty, honestly.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Can I just ask for clarification on the motion, just so I understand the motion? Resolution is shown on the screen. What I understood that motion to intend to do is indicate in this part C, it was to say it meets the
That would
the
be
intent,
resolution R18.
and then down here approves, just to make sure I understood the motion to approve. It would select the approves under the be it resolved, and under C it would select the meets the intent.
Yeah, so it's approving the landscaping plan, which is grass.
Okay,
So,
that's
Yep.
clarified. Any other questions? Commissioner Seltzer?
Thank you, Mayor. I think both sides have merit, but when we come down to looking at what was previously described here, would it be improved if we had and I disagree, it is a detailed site plan. It's detailed with thousands of pieces of grass, but it's still, you don't need a drawing of that to know what it's like. And I think this would be a really nice improvement on that intersection, on the visibility, on highlighting the library, which is, if you're coming down from out of town and see that nice, very nice library we have, I don't see how this harms anything. And, the demolition, I assume, is at the cost of the owners. And what would be better? I mean, let's be logical. A nice open grass space that has no specific use, or a broken down building that is deteriorating. So I think we need to take that all into account rather than all the technical details of what's going to go in there. Changes in that may occur at any time, and thoughts, and I don't think anything that would be objectionable would be allowed in there. So I think allowing them to do this would be a positive thing for the city.
Would you like to make a motion?
It's already a motion. It's already, yeah, there's.
It's already there, okay, it's
Yep.
already here.
We have a motion and a second. Any other comments? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion, say aye.
aye.
Any opposed?
No, or nay.
Any abstentions?
I'm going to abstain.
Okay. So it's
3-1-1.
3-1-1. Yeah, 4-1-1. 1, 2, 3, 4. I get a vote too.
Gotcha.
Yep,
Okay.
if you want.
All right, so that motion does carry. And that takes us to the next item.
Excuse me, Mayor, what was the count on that? I didn't,
It was,
Passed.
it passed 4-1-1.
thank you.
And that will not go on to council. This is.
No, this is the governing body on that issue. Item number 8 is to discuss and make recommendations for the proposed ordinance amendments to section 78-517, the downtown design overlay zoning district requirements. So we're just kind of picking up where we left off. You want to review it, or you just want to get after it?
I think we can get after it, but if I can just make one statement. As staff, we certainly tried to take into consideration what we've been hearing from you in developing this ordinance, and one aspect of it really stood out to us, and Commissioner Barman really was poetic in talking about not having contributing and non-contributing language, because that kind of connotated historic preservation aspects of it. So we certainly understood that, and I think that there was, in some respects, some support to have the Landmarks Commission potentially consider efforts to create local landmark, either district or local landmark status for some of the other buildings. Just to add to that, I wanted to highlight there are actually 14 buildings within the blocks of the historic district that are local landmarks. So those are protected already within the Chapter 38 requirements. One of the other things you'll see is a point that we struggled with is some of the demolition language that was proposed, and we have to contemplate how that's dealt with. obviously would make it very hard to tear down any building within the district. And certainly there's some buildings downtown that probably don't have the character, whether they're historic or old, or just the character of those buildings probably isn't what the design criteria now would articulate as part of a new structure in that area. So in that spirit, we worked with the city attorney to try to develop or refine some of the language with that backdrop. And we'll walk through it and give you our input and get your input and give you our thoughts on the revisions as we go.
I could just point out what I think are the big three policy issues that are kind of out there. One is the draft that you have in front of you tonight. If you look at the definition of demolition, so this would be on, for me, it's section 3D. That's now been modified to define demolition to mean the razing of a building or structure, instead of what it said before, which is the razing or destruction entirely or insignificant part of a building or structure. And the thinking there was that if someone's going to remove part of a building but not raise the building, that seems to fit more under the description of a structural project and should be reviewed as a structural project rather than in fact, the definition of structural project already refers to the, among other things, the addition or removal of bulk to an existing building. So there was some overlap between the definition of structural project and demolition. And so that was the thinking behind that change. I just want to make sure you're aware of it. The second significant issue is this open policy question. Should demolition be regulated at all under this chapter or not? As Mr. Sheila has indicated, that apparently there was some discussion at the last meeting about perhaps leaving that issue to be addressed under Chapter 38 and allow that to be handled only for locally designated landmarks and not address it under Chapter 78. This draft of the ordinance still leaves demolition as an issue that would be regulated under this chapter if you choose to leave it in. I think it is a fair comment that getting approval to demolish a building under this standard would be exceedingly difficult. But now the definition of demolition has been modified so that it applies only to razing a building. It doesn't apply to, for example, we have a gentleman who was seeking and maybe is still looking for approval to remove part of a structure in connection with a proposed project. And so this clarifies that that wouldn't be deemed a demolition project, that would be deemed a structural project and subject to review as a structural project. And the last issue that that I highlighted as kind of a biggie is this question of landscaping. The draft you have in front of you under section 5, five C 5 indicates that an application for approval of a structural project requires submission of a detailed landscaping plan of the subject property that meets the requirements of Table 78-604. The suggestion here is that it would be helpful to have a more definite standard to use when you're dealing with the question of landscaping. I don't know if this is the right answer or not, but at least it's a starting point for you all. And that table, basically, that table 78-604 indicates that in the, it provides a kind of a point system, and that the point requirements vary depending on the district. So this would be the central business district. And really, the only landscaping requirement that comes into play under this table is where you have paved area. Then you have to meet some point requirements. But again, I'm not saying that's the right answer, but I do think it would be a useful thing for you to at least provide some clarity as to what the landscaping requirements are, so the next time you have to address that, you have something a little more meaty to work with than what you had on the last item. And those, to me, were the more kind of significant issues that I think are still out there for policy discussion. There are other edits that you'll see sprinkled throughout here that obviously you may want to take a look at.
Anybody have any questions or comments on where we're at?
I have quite a few.
Sure.
But I apologize to the commission that this is kind of my bailiwick, so I put a lot of thought into it. Plus, I know I've come to the commission in the past, and I've made references to some things I thought might help, and I wanted to make sure I provide that kind of stuff. So I can go second, though. I want to see if there's anything else that the rest of the commission, your guys' input first, because otherwise it might take a little bit to run through some of the things I want to point out.
Did anyone else want to go first, or?
I'm having it.
I mean, the only comment I would make is we're going through this. I don't think that it should have been or ever will be that easy just to demolition a building in the downtown, because we do value our downtown, and we certainly want to do what we can to maintain it. And if there's situations that arise that somebody may feel required to remove a building, we certainly want to replace it with something that is suitable and fits in with the downtown. And that goes for the Kittlesons if they decide someday them or the next generation wants to put up a building in that spot. I do think it should be according to whatever guidelines that we agree to, so it fits in the downtown area. So as we go through this, I mean, that's kind of what I'm trying to keep in mind. It shouldn't be you can just willy-nilly tear down a building because you want to. But if you do decide, you should have a plan that puts up a building that is, in my mind, is equal or better as far as the design characteristics. That's just me personally. So I think the process that we've gone through, there's some lessons to be learned there that I think we can apply to this as we move forward. That's about all I had to say on it. Did anybody else have any specific comments? Alderperson Jensen?
I know we talked about it the last time about eliminating any mention of demolition, and I think you made some comments about it at that time. But I guess to Matt, with Section 38 and then having the references here in 78, is that a redundancy then?
I'm not sure if redundancy is the right answer, but so I think the issue is this. You have the opportunity under Chapter 38, the city does, to designate local landmarks and then subject those buildings to the protection that's provided under Chapter 38, including protection from demolition unless you can meet the standard for demolition under that chapter, which is a difficult standard to meet. So that process exists for buildings that are designated as local landmarks. The question under Chapter 78 is, in this downtown design overlay district, should you afford fairly similar level of protection from demolition to buildings that are not designated as local landmarks but are in that district? As Mr. Scheel indicated, I think there may be some buildings in that district that would not be recognized as buildings that should be given that kind of treatment. They don't, they don't necessarily further the interest the city seems to have in this district by saying, well, you can't take that building down unless you can show one of these things. So maybe you've got, I don't know which building it is, but apparently there's maybe one or two, if not more, that where you'd say, wait, maybe we shouldn't tied people's hands on those structures in the same way that we do on other structures. So that's the question is, do you want to impose that kind of demolition control on that downtown design district, even though that you might have a broader reach of capturing buildings that go beyond what you'd really want to capture?
So if we remove that from 78, if there's no mention of it,
Yep.
that means that anybody could come in and just go to our planning department and request a permit to go ahead and demolish, and they should be able to get it,
If it's not a local landmark.
if it's not a local landmark.
Right.
Otherwise, it would be under 38.
Correct.
Okay, and what Tim was saying is that, do we want to do that? I think, right, Tim? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
If you want to do that, and the way this is drafted, and it's just a draft, is you would be required to replace it with something that's equal or better in the design characteristics. And that would probably discourage most people from doing that anyway, because at the end of the day, they tear down a building and they're putting up another one that's basically the same size, has the same height, the same shape in most cases. What would be the point of doing that? You know, so I think that's what Chapter 78 would do. Kind of the other moving piece here is the Landmarks Commission has made a budget request to go through and try to get some of the other downtown buildings designated. And if they're successful in that effort, that takes a lot of these buildings that are in question out of play. We won't even have to worry about them. But, you know, that's going to be a process in itself.
So, but by changing the description of demolition, we're basically, well, like creating an issue, what was it, 138, I think was West Main? Like they're not going to raise the whole building, they're just going to take the back portion of the building off.
Yeah, that didn't fall into
That's the plan. So that would not fall under those guidelines, and they should be able to go
Well,
ahead and do that.
That would be deemed a structural project,
Yep,
and they would need approval from the Plan Commission under the structural project
Yep.
criteria, which would kind of feed into the design guidelines
Yep.
that are in here now.
so.
But it wouldn't be subject to the standard that you need for demolition.
Yeah, so basically then the way we have it worded, it seems like we're offering an extra bit of protection to buildings that may or may not need that protection or warrant that protection. That's what I'm hearing.
That's maybe
If
where
you
you
leave
are.
it, if you leave demolition
So,
in there.
so do we then revisit this, say like if we passed it as it is or with other adjustments? Do we then revisit this and remove the demolition once the Landmarks has gone through and done their work on designating buildings downtown? I mean, what's
That's one of
what's the
the,
future look like?
I think that's one of the options that was in there, would be to, I think there was some talk about having a sunset in there for that purpose.
Here's the way, I'll be honest, I'm even having trouble with this one. Demolition in, demolition out. And this, maybe if we go back to because I think this is much improved, so I thank staff, because I think it cleans it up.
As do I.
I think there's some things that we can do to even clean it up some more. But I think we have to look at demolition, the demolitions protections in 78 are serving a different role than demolition protections in 38. Demolitions protections in 38 are trying to prevent the demolition of a historic landmark and a historic building, which there are plenty in downtown. But we want that covered by them, okay? Demolition here, I think, is trying to maintain the design integrity of the district. So take history out of it again. When we're thinking about demolition in 78 and the protections that we want here, it's not just, well, if it's not a historic building, we don't care, tear it down. Because that could affect the design integrity of the district. Which, for example, I mean, I think the structure that was just approved is historic, it's contributing. But let's take the history portion out of it, okay? And not argue it from a perspective, I don't want it demolished because it's a historic building. To me, taking that building out changes the design dynamic of that intersection. where you had a building. Now, I understand it's vacant, it's deteriorated, but it's deteriorated in part because there's been a lack of investment in the building. If you would have had a Christmas store in that building, we wouldn't even have this argument. If the building was maintained and there was a Christmas store in it, you'd be going from room to room buying Christmas ornaments, and there were trees and all. I mean, everyone would think it was the greatest building in all downtown. You know what I'm saying? So the issue is when you remove the protections in 78 would be that if you take a building like that down, that's not a landmark as the way Stoughton defines it, then we need to maintain the design integrity of that intersection. And to me, having a grass lot there doesn't maintain the design integrity. And we start thinking applying the same kinds of argument that were applied at that intersection to some of the other corners, to say, well, let's say we tear down another corner building because it opens up a nice view of the building next door. Okay, because that's basically what they're saying, is you'll have a better view of the library coming from the north, or you'll have a better view of their building now coming from the south. That's not a reason to take down, for example, the corner building there, so you can see the one next to it. Or I know the movie theater is for sale right now, okay, and that's not a contributing building to the historic district. So if by not demolishing that building, we're protecting the street wall. So if, for example, if they came in and just tore that down now and put a grass lot there, okay, that changes the design integrity of that block in the district. Okay, so it's not just a historic argument. It's a design. It's the way the downtown functions in terms of street wall and creating a wall to the sidewalk, a room to the downtown Main Street. Ideally, more storefronts active storefronts along the street. So I think that's the way we have to look at demolition within 78. Okay, that there may be some structures that if we're not making every building a landmark, that this could kind of come into play for a design quality, design integrity purpose.
Could I offer a couple follow-up thoughts after listening to your point? So if that's the concern, then the concern is not save that building,
Right.
but the concern is what goes there when that comes down, right?
Correct.
And the way this demolition section is drafted now,
Yes.
it really is putting all of these standards seem to be directed at saving the building or making sure it's not taken down unless there's a really great reason to take it down. This is not really structured to address your concern,
Other
the
than
way that it's drafted now,
the development agreement requirement.
other than to say, yeah.
And so that kicks you into then having to fulfill the design standards. See, so it's indirectly by having the development agreement. Now you've agreed that you're going to do something, and then what you have to do has to be done to quality. So it's not allowing you to do nothing.
So one possible approach, based on your concern about design integrity, is to say, okay, let's modify this section to say, not to make it so difficult to show you can get the approval to tear it down, but instead put the focus on what you're going to replace it with.
Yes. There you go.
So you don't have to prove, for example, that cost of repair would exceed 85% of the assessed value. You say, look, go ahead, tear it down,
Yes.
but you've got to have approval to replace it with something that will address your concern about design integrity.
Yes.
And that's a very different approach than what
Yes.
this takes right now.
And I'm still not, I'm still a little uncomfortable with that because I'm a historic preservationist. But I think that's the appropriate stance to take from a Chapter 78 perspective, as uncomfortable as I am with it. Because that's otherwise you're creating a historic district without going through due process.
And so then the next question is, assuming the decision is, okay, let's explore that one step further, we're going to make it easy to answer the question, yes, you can tear it down and put the focus on what next.
Yes.
So then what does the what next look like? Is it, okay, it's fine as long as we have an adequate landscaping in there, you don't have to put a building in, or are we going to say, no, you got to have a building, and that's the logical next step of the discussion?
Well, I think the way we've approached it up to this point was that there needs to be a building in there, the way it's written now. But I know in conversations we've had in the past, I know that's where you start running into the difficulty of having teeth in it. So let's say they sign a development agreement, they've torn it down, and then later say, well, no, I'm not gonna go through with it, or my financing fell through, or I've changed my mind, and now they back out of the development agreement, you've lost the building, but what is it, does the city really have any power to force them to develop, to force them to build, you know what I'm saying?
Well, it's a very difficult problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've talked in the past about, one way of thinking about this is letting the market take care of the problem.
Yes.
And, kind of imagining that if someone invests that kind of money in a building on Main Street, that it's not really in their economic interest to let it sit vacant. That's one potential way to approach the problem. And I can certainly imagine a scenario where someone does invest in that property and isn't certain what they're going to do immediately and wants some transition period. I want to buy it, I want to remove the building, and then I want some time to figure out what happens next, and I'm not ready to go tomorrow. And so if you let the market take care of it, you allow for that space. If you're not comfortable with that, and you're saying, how can we develop an ordinance that really guarantees that we get a building there relatively quickly after the first one comes down, yeah, then we're talking about a much more challenging process. And right now, the language we've got in here that requires a development agreement, the development agreement is indeed defined in such a way that it requires, in order to construct a new building, within 36 months. It does not express, right now it includes language that expressly says that the agreement shall not include a requirement that the obligations be secured by some kind of financial security. And so, yeah, and even if it is, I can't imagine what would we do? Like, oh, we're going to draw on the letter of credit and we're going to build your building for you. I just can't see that.
Yeah.
I just don't see that as a realistic.
And we went through this whole discussion at Landmarks for,
Yeah.
it seemed like many hours.
Yeah, it's a tough one, and I know, there's 3 different documents which I found in advance of this meeting that I can make available to staff and they can distribute to you guys. I'm not gonna read them now. But there's one here, that is a, process for demolition built on economic non-viability. So when you're making the argument that economically, there's no value in this building, which is what they were making, it has a much more formal process that they have to go through to essentially lay out the case for economic non-viability.
Okay.
Another one out of Dubuque, if I'm getting these correct, Dubuque has demolition guidelines that require, either this Irving, California, one of the two, that actually require that there is an approved plan, a development plan in place. So they have to show in advance, kind of like we were saying that they had to have a landscape plan before approving demolition.
Mm-hmm.
If you're putting emphasis on a building, then they actually have to come before demolition and have that plan for development. And it could be development just of that parcel, or it could be development of multiple parcels that they're looking at, redeveloping a larger section of your district. And then you have that development has to abide by all the code and all the guidelines, but then the commission can actually evaluate that yes, this meets all the guidelines, and this is actually seriously better than what's sitting there now. So if someone came in with a development proposal for the lot that the movie theater's on, and it actually is a multi-story building that fills the lot and everything else, it fulfills the guidelines, then it could be like an easy thing and say, go for it.
Can I just ask, so it requires a plan?
Yes.
Does it require a legally binding contract to build in accordance with the plan and financial security that allows the city to take your money and go in and build it if you don't?
I did not see that.
Yeah, I don't.
See, that's the challenge.
Yeah.
So one of the, I like your idea of having the market come into play, and there's communities I work with nationally, and I don't know what Stoughton Pollux here would allow, but nationally, there's a strategy to push the market a little bit by having a vacancy real estate tax, whereas rather than having, what typically happens if you have a vacant parcel and there's no improvement, the parcel is actually assessed lower, and so you pay less taxes on it. What they do is, there's a lot of evidence that shows that vacant parcels actually cost the community, and vacant buildings, both vacant buildings and vacant parcels, cost the community money, because you have deferred income, you have higher issues related to vandalism, you have higher issues related to police protection, all those kinds of things. So what they've done is they've created an escalated real estate rate. So if a parcel is vacant and for over a period of time, not just short term, it has to be vacant for a period of time with no efforts to either sell the parcel or to lease it out, then their mill rate goes up and they're paying higher taxes on it. That pushes the market so that it's now not as economically desirable to have it sit there vacant.
I don't see that working in Wisconsin because we have a uniformity clause that affects how we can tax, and the city doesn't control this assessment. That's up to the assessor. So we have an assessment process and a uniformity clause that would prevent the city from saying, well, we're going to create some kind of special tax rules that apply to vacant parcels. So that's not an option. That, as far as I can see, in terms of saying it's going to cost you more to leave it vacant. What we have in Wisconsin, what I have seen is, instead of that kind of approach, our statutes give us instead the opportunity to provide some financial assistance, TIF, to try and spur something to happen. So it's more of the carrot rather than the stick approach.
Did you have any other comments specific to where we're at, or?
I do. I have general
Okay.
comments about the rewrite.
All right, so
besides the demolition.
Okay. Anything else on the demolition, or should we circle back to it?
If I could just make,
Sure.
I think, I just wanted to express that my preference would be to take that avenue, to take the emphasis off the demolition and put the emphasis on what happens afterwards. You know, the plan.
And do you mean by that you'd like to remove demolition as something that is regulated under
Not
this?
exactly sure how we would do it. I'll let your expertise take that.
I can't do it without you.
Yeah, it's
So
a
here's,
policy decision.
yeah.
Yeah, how would you do that?
I can give you
I
choices.
guess that would be the way to do it then, is to remove that and then put the emphasis on what comes.
So I can think of two choices based on the discussion we've had. One is to simply take demolition out and let the market dictate what happens next, knowing that what happens next would be subject to your approval under somebody's structural project review.
And the standards that we would put forward.
The standards are the ones in here.
Yeah.
And it's gonna be on, the onus will be on us to make sure the standards and criteria are there.
Yeah.
That would be one approach. The other approach, which gets more complicated, is to leave demolition in, but to say, we don't care, whether your building is in good shape or bad shape. We're going to let you tear it down, but we're going to need approval of some kind of a plan or something to replace it before
I
we'll...
want to uncomplicate it.
Well, these are your choices.
Yeah.
I would be uncomfortable just taking it out, because I just have a feeling that you're leaving the door open for another, oh my goodness, now we have lost another building that's just going to be a lot, and with no intention of ever developing on it. Because if you do it that way, the only time we actually have a say in quality is if they come to you with a proposal. So if their intention is never to come to the city with a proposal, they're just going to leave it.
That's why I say you need to have focus on, okay, fine, if you're going to do this, then we need to know what are you going to do.
Yes, so then you have to have
Follow the standards
so you have
that-
to leave demolition in then, but you change the way that we're wording the evaluation process for
That's what I was
demolition.
trying to get at.
Yeah, okay. Good.
Well, and I think the other thing that is kind of working through the channels is this whole discussion about the minimum maintenance ordinance. And that's something that another committee is going to be working on. That's going to be, I would anticipate, that could be a lengthy process. But in some cases, I think that takes at least this last vote out of play, because we really didn't have an ordinance that required, you know, the current or the previous owner to maintain the level of standards that would have protected that building. And the hope is that the ordinance will be strengthened, so that won't come into play again. But there's no guarantees. But that is something that the landmarks made the recommendation, and right now I believe it's at Public Works. And, you know, there's just at the very beginning stages of that process, and that could take a while to go through. So you can just kind of keep that one in the back of your mind, and maybe even monitor those meetings to see if there's some input that you'd like to give that group as they work on that.
Okay. So I'll try to quickly run through my other comments. No, I'll just start off again. I think this is much improved. Okay. Under definitions, we have, the first, right under section 78, we have 1, 2, 3. 3 is definitions. We have maintenance, renovation, and structural project. And I think those are good. Although I know from working in the industry, there is a lot of misunderstanding about the difference between renovation, restoration, rehabilitation, and what they all mean, even remodeling and all the rest.
We had that discussion as staff.
Yeah, and so
So
I
we
went back
get
and I
it.
looked for some, I think the definition of renovation here is good, but there's places in the ordinance rewrites where we still have reference to rehabilitation and restoration, and they're not defined. And they're toward the back, and so we're gonna have to deal with it. I got 2 different ways that we could potentially deal with it. But I think, one of the things I think is important for, at least the way I use ordinances in the work that I do, is that not only are they designed to, hopefully, from a municipal perspective, get the kind of development that we want, but they're an education tool. It's a way to lay out the playing field for property owners and to help educate them. And I think this particular ordinance, because of the guidelines section, I think becomes an important educational tool. And so I think it doesn't hurt to at least have the definition of rehabilitation in here as well, and to make reference, because this is, there's a good number of the properties here that are either local landmarks but are at least contributing to the nationally registered district, and that allows them to take advantage of historic preservation tax credits, which makes rehabilitation a key term that I think is important to define and to know.
Can I just stop you there?
Yeah.
So if we're going to add rehabilitation as a separate category of work,
Yes.
distinct from renovation, right?
Can we define, to answer your question, do we have to have it be a different category of work, or can we at least define it?
Well, I don't, is the intent to have it fall within the scope of or under, as a subunit of renovation? Or would it be a subunit of structural project?
Rehabilitation is more of a structural project than a renovation, but it kind of depends on how you approach it.
So what's the purpose of, why is it necessary to add, to say, are you saying that it would be a subunit of structural project shall be subject to review under that standard?
No. I guess maybe I'm going about this the wrong way. I don't want to create a third category of development. I want to define a term.
Why? Why do we need it? Why
understand.
can't we take it out and have that?
Because I think it's important to understanding, number one, because they're in a nationally registered historic district, and rehabilitation is part of the Secretary of Interior standards. It's part of the development issue within the district that these property owners are facing.
What would the regulatory significance be in this ordinance of saying we have a definition of rehabilitation now?
It's more of a chapter 38, isn't it?
Well, I'm just saying under chapter 78, if we call it out, what is the practical consequence of that under this ordinance? Does that mean I'm now subject to some different standards if I want to do something, or am I still subject to?
Well, here I think it would It's a good question, and I hadn't thought about it from that perspective. The way I would probably look at it is more within the context of when you get to the 7 design standards. When you're into the 7 design standards section, we start out with renovation, structural projects. Both are included here, and it talks about the guidelines for the kinds of work that's being done. And I think that there's places in here that, well, one, that rehabilitation is still listed.
We should get it out, unless we're gonna do something with it.
But I still think from an intent, a desire, a municipal desire for the district, for this overlay district, it would be great if property owners actually did rehabilitate their buildings, not just renovate. So it could be something that is encouraged, but not required.
So you wanna say that under some circumstances, we're going to say to you, if you come to us, you got a project, we're gonna say, you want an ordinance that allows us to say, we're gonna push you in this direction of
Not
rehabilitation.
required, not push or require.
Okay,
But when we're talking about guidelines, the guidelines for design, that certainly if they are meeting the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation, that you're going to be meeting the guidelines.
well, why don't you just work on the guidelines then, and make the guidelines say what you want? You don't have to have the word rehabilitation in
All
here
right.
somewhere.
I will think about that.
That to me is the answer.
I will think about that.
Okay.
All right.
I have a question about that, and I'm
Sure.
just like, if somebody had a downtown building, and if they were to call a contractor to do work, or somebody that's specialized in,
Yes.
and they said, I'm looking at doing renovation, or I'm looking at doing rehabilitation
Yeah.
to a contractor or a specialist in this line of work, do they look at that as, well, do you mean, by saying that, do you mean this, or by saying
Yeah.
that, do you mean this?
Well, I think it can clarify, potentially by having it as part of a definition, it can clarify where it falls, because you're right, there's going to be confusion, because renovation, by definition, means make new again, and it's cosmetic changes, and it's updating, okay? So by renovation, we're talking about make new again, cosmetic changes, updating, which doesn't really jive that well with historic preservation. And a lot of people say renovation is the opposite of
Well, but again, aren't we-
historic preservation. I'm just saying, okay? So whereas with structural project, that tends to be more of like a remodel or rehabilitation and that kind of work. And whereas restoration, which some people often get confused, restoration is taking it back to a particular time period, and I don't want that in here.
Right.
Okay, that's basically saying, restoration is saying, we want to bring that building back to the way
Back
it
to some
was when it
earlier
was
state.
built.
Some
Okay,
earlier
so,
manifestation of itself.
so I guess what got me thinking about this was whether we should be using the word rehabilitation versus renovation. But the way that we've laid the code out, it's more, the definition of renovation is more in line with what we're evaluating. It's the make new again, it's the cosmetic changes, it's the updating, it's those kinds of things that we're evaluating. So I think renovation, the term, fits
Okay.
with what we're doing.
Okay.
It's often replacing materials, okay? So renovation is often replacing historic materials as well. So I think it's important for us as a commission to understand, by making the decision to go with renovation instead of rehabilitation, which is, rehabilitate means retain and repair historic elements, and then where you've lost historic elements or where they're not coming into play, then you can use modern materials, do whatever you want. Okay, so rehabilitation is that balance of historic materials, historic, not restoration, but it's respecting historic materials, but giving you a lot of freedom and leeway with the building otherwise.
And to me, the focus here should be, in terms of your comments, on whether you're satisfied that the standards in Section 7, design standards, are achieving the objectives you think they should achieve in this district. I think that's the more important issue on this point. Not What?
Don't worry about whether people are getting confused about renovation versus rehabilitation and other terms.
I'm worried about putting in a term here that causes confusion about what our ordinance requires.
All right, fair enough. That's fair enough. All right. So then, moving on, I think the early parts, one I went back and I looked for other definitions of demolition that more aligns with what we had discussed at the end of our last meeting, which was removal of any square footage. One of the concerns, I understand this, why you might shift it this way, because demolition of a small part throws it into structural project. But I'm looking at let's say, for example, the project that we evaluated at the last meeting, which was to take off the addition. What if instead the proposal was to take off everything but the addition? And now it's just a structural project, not a demolition. You know what I'm saying? If we're not really specifying any threshold.
They would have to demonstrate to you that what they're proposing is consistent with the design guidelines in the ordinance.
But it's still allowing them to tear it. There's no question about whether they can take it down.
Only if you agree that what they're proposing is consistent with the design guidelines.
Okay.
If they come in and say, we want to remove all this bulk over here, and this is what we're left with,
Okay.
if you look at that and say, based on our guidelines, that's not consistent with our guidelines, and here's why, then you could say no. If it is consistent with the guidelines, then yeah, you'd have to say yes.
I think they'd have a hard time if they were gonna do something with the facade, for example, because in the guidelines, I think it's pretty clear of what the shape, size, and expectations are. If it's not, we could certainly try to make that more clear.
And I would just say on the design guidelines, they didn't come from me at all, and this is where you all should be putting all your energy, because I have no particular expertise or knowledge whatsoever when it comes to what they should be. I'm more focused on kind of the procedural and the legal thinking about this. These guidelines came out of that.
Right. No, I understand that. I had left the last meeting, with the understanding that we were going toward a definition of demolition, which was the removal of any square footage. And that's consistent with a lot of the definitions of demolition that I found in other ordinances and from other communities, such as the raising, wrecking, or removal of a total structure, or the raising, wrecking, or removal of any part of a structure resulting in a reduction in its mass, height, or volume. And so they're looking at any reduction in square footage as a demolition. So, but I understand that we're approaching, within the context of the ordinance, that we have the structural project. So I'll think about that, but
That's where it is right now.
It's a shift in my head.
Yep, got it.
All right. So then when we're moving forward in terms of the lands, I'm going to go all the way to that initial point, the third policy question you brought up in terms of the landscaping.
Yeah.
My concern about having it just be, and I like trying to have more definition of that landscape plan in terms of what we're looking for, but just going by the requirements of table 78604, from just my own use of that table from a planned business zoning class, I mean, it's primarily designed for
Paved surfaces.
what's that? Paved surfaces and vehicular landscape issues such as trees along the street frontage and those kinds of things. It's not really designed for a pedestrian scale environment or a downtown streetscape. So I think there would be some other criteria that we'd want to develop into that landscape definition rather than just 78604.
Did you have? Oh,
Yeah, we'd look for some input because, you know, the building mass and the character of the district really precludes landscaping in 99% of the sites.
Yeah,
So that's,
unless the building comes down.
And that's maybe where
Yeah,
you
that-
want to have maybe you want to say, if there's a building on the site, then these are the standards. If it's a vacant site, then these are the standards.
Yeah.
If you have something for us, we would certainly
Well, I
welcome
think
it.
you could definitely even just include make additional reference to the guidelines for setbacks that talk about pertaining to parking lots and unbuilt areas. I mean, you could repeat that language as relates to the detailed landscaping plan so they don't lose sight of that. Because now it's kind of lost in the setback section, which people are thinking about building setbacks. So I think that's certainly one thing that could add to that detail.
Pertaining to setbacks and,
Under the, currently, if you want the, item A, under 7A, design standards, it talks about building setback. And it says, note, this also pertains to parking lot areas and unbuilt areas. The edge of the sidewalk should be emphasized with some visible barrier, such as a decorative wall or planting, so that the setback is recognized. I think that's probably even more appropriately tied to the detailed landscape plan there, or be in both places, because I think otherwise it gets lost. Because I think when you look at building setback, you're not thinking of parking lot.
so is the idea if you've got a vacant lot on Main Street, you've got the street, you've got the sidewalk, that there would be like some kind of landscaping
Some kind of,
along the sidewalk
there's a
edge or something like
defining
that?
edge. There are some places that actually require that you come in with a screen wall and have that screen wall create that sidewall to the, and they have ordinances to make sure that it's a screen wall that is ornamental in nature or has some sort of design elements to it. Some will come in and they'll have, like history, historic plaques, or murals or panoramas of the history of the downtown district. It's the same way as when you go into a mall, and if there's a vacancy within the mall, the leases require that those vacancies come in with a blank wall in order to maintain that street wall inside the interior of the mall. So there's different ways you can write that up. Now, that's not to say that that's always going to result in good design, but at least it provides an edge to the parking area, or screening to the parking area, those kinds of things.
So right now, this building setback provision does say, this also pertains to unbuilt areas. So I guess the question is, if somebody comes in today and says, I'm gonna take this building down, I'm gonna leave it vacant for a while, here's what I'm gonna do, is this enough? Is this enough of a guideline, of a standard, for them to have an idea of what's required?
I don't
That's how I would
know
look
if it's enough yet, but I think it's an important start, and I think what I'm saying is it's getting lost where it is.
Yeah,
Because it's under building setback. No one who's thinking about doing
right.
a grassy lawn space is gonna find it.
Right, maybe there
there.
should be a guideline relating to landscaping that talks about landscaping.
Yes,
If that's the issue.
right.
So is that something, if we put something together, we could just shoot it to you and you could look at it?
Oh, yeah, or I can see if I can find,
Yeah.
put together a few
I
words
think what we
too.
want to do is I think we're making progress and we'll want to keep it moving.
Yeah,
So
I
when
can
we
put
come
some-
back to the next meeting, some of these issues at least can be somewhat vetted before we get it to the larger group.
Yep, you bet. Moving ahead to J, under exterior materials. I'm not sure, if we're trying to get historic material out, I'm not sure period correct
Right.
changes that. I think there's probably other ways to probably address the design quality there, and if you want, I can take a stab at it. I didn't get a chance. I just kind of circled it as being something, and that's also one of the first places where, if you see in any rehabilitation project, the quality of finished materials varies wildly, so we've got rehabilitation showing up there.
Right, I think we need
Place
to
in there.
Yeah,
probably
so we
take
need
it
to,
out.
we need to clean that up
somehow, right.
there. If you go down to L, awnings, you took out the first reference to historically appropriate, which I think is good, but then the next sentence, under avoid awnings with a curved profile, it says, as these are not historically appropriate. So we can strike that as well, to be consistent. And then, I wasn't sure if we go to M. Exterior colors, when we get to the one where you've X'd out the primary red, blue, green, and yellow colors, black and fluorescent day glow. Is that just because of feedback you're getting from applicants that they're not understanding that particular one, or is that,
We're trying to understand whether they would be prohibited or not,
okay.
because it seems like this would prohibit them.
My gut reaction is that I think it might not be necessary to prohibit primary red, blue, green, and yellow, because you get misinterpretation here that they can't have anything, any form of green. But I don't know about I think the day glow, the neon, I think that's the concern that most people have, is the really fluorescent bright colors that you'll sometimes find within a district. But maybe there's a way of putting that under the high gloss, well, maybe don't.
Well, it can still be in there, just take out the colors, but fluorescent, day glow, and neon colors shall not be permitted. I mean, something like that.
Yeah, I think that portion of it is probably the bigger concern. And just having the primary red, blue, green, and yellow there, then people start getting concerned, well,
Right, we can't do
I
it.
can't have any forms of blue or any forms of red.
We heard that tonight.
Yeah, so I think that's the part that is open to misunderstanding. Signage, under signage O, we've got a bullet there that says some lettering styles evoke different time areas considering the date and style of the building when selecting typefaces. I would get that out. I mean, again, since we're not emphasizing the historic, I don't think there's any reason for us to evaluate typefaces on whether they're appropriate to the architecture. I think that would be really hard for the commission to do. Plus, I'm a big believer that the typeface should fit the business concept and the logo of the business more than the building. All right, so then here's where it gets really kind of messed up still. And that is, once you hit the P, well, the former P with the cleaning and the rehabilitation restoration, we've stricken cleaning here. And I think maybe that needs to be under maintenance, because I think it's still a very important maintenance issue and concern, that structural components and exterior materials shall be cleaned when necessary using the gentlest means possible. I think that's still an important part of maintenance, but I think that's something that staff can evaluate as they evaluate maintenance proposals, if you guys can agree.
We
Well,
normally
so
don't.
just to be clear, so you want to include cleaning as something that would be defined as maintenance, which means that in order to conduct cleaning operations, you need to come and talk to Michael and get his approval and demonstrate that you're going to do it in accordance with this standard?
I think that's one way to, I don't want it to go away, but I'm thinking it might be better under that section than this section. Because it's really, I don't know if cleaning.
Well, this is part of that. When
The
you say
enforcement is the question
Isn't
here.
that going to be coming under the minimum maintenance standards?
No.
well,
Well, that'd probably fall under your landmarks has
Yeah.
criteria related to this.
yeah.
For the
Yeah.
landmarks.
It's over-regulating, I don't think we need it. I'm fine
Here-
with it.
Here's the issue, you take this out, and even if it's not a historic property, and you sandblast a masonry structure, and we're encouraging masonry in other parts of this. And so if you and there's a lot of misunderstanding amongst the public about sandblasting as relates to masonry. And if you allow sandblasting within a historic district where we're encouraging masonry, you essentially destroy that masonry, and it's only a matter of time before it weathers and decomposes, and we've created a big issue downtown. And so I think it still makes sense within a masonry district that we're encouraging, in part because of fire codes and everything else, that we have something very clear in terms of disallowing sandblasting.
Well, yeah, I think with
Within the
sandblasting, we could certainly enforce.
Yeah.
The cleaning part of it, I don't see how we're gonna go around and.
But these are guidelines, although I suppose we don't have guidelines under the maintenance section.
Well, so right now, maintenance, it doesn't, I wouldn't read maintenance right now. It says work involving maintaining the existing exterior appearance of a building or structure, such as repainting, re-roofing, residing, or replacing with the same colors, finishes, and materials. I have not, at least to this point, understood that definition to include cleaning. Like, let's say now, and I don't see sandblasting as cleaning either, but maybe it is. I do remember this issue coming up in Oregon when we worked on their downtown maintenance standards.
Yeah.
And so I know it was addressed there, and I know there was a concern about what practice, it was exactly what you said. People were concerned about masonry and doing damage to it. So I think the question is whether this is the right place to deal with that. I'm not sure. It might be, or it might be in the maintenance code, but I'm not sure. Maybe not, though, because we don't want it to apply
To the whole city.
citywide. So it may be, so I guess the policy question for you all is whether you want to include some kinds of activities like sandblasting as something that might fall within, maintenance, for example, and then subject it to a standard like the cleaning one that's in there now.
Or you can make it a prohibited practice in
Or
the
just
entire
say,
district,
or,
right?
or somehow make it a prohibited practice, right? If that's the one, if it's just sandblasting that you're concerned about.
Well, it's the one I'm most concerned about, but even high-pressure water.
Right.
High-pressure water can actually take off the patina or the exterior crust of the brick as well, but even more so, it forces water into the interior of the building. A lot of those brick buildings are two-faced, and you start forcing water in between with the high-pressure water. And again, where do you draw the line in terms of what you regulate and don't regulate? Some of this is just common sense for property owners, which is why I think it makes sense to leave it here in the guidelines, rather than if you throw it in maintenance, then it becomes a requirement that staff has to say, you can't do it at all to.
These are design guidelines, that's where our struggle was.
Yeah.
We're talking about
It doesn't-
regulating construction.
Yeah.
We're looking at a maintenance practice here, and so that's what we're trying to.
I
That's why you
understand
got-
why you struck cleaning. It's
Yeah.
just, I don't know if there's some other way that we can, and I'm open to suggestions.
Why don't I look at what we did in Oregon, because I know we did something,
Okay,
and I'll look at it and see what we did and see if it can help us here.
okay. Then to wrap this up, one, I think that now taking out the contributing, non-contributing, you really shorten, because you can lose all the rest of that back end of the ordinance. But when we look at what's currently still P, Q, R, S here up until the end, all the way through entrances and porches, all of that, if you look at the original ordinances, that whole section was actually inset underneath rehabilitation and restoration. And when you read those descriptions, they still read like historic preservation. And so I don't have an answer to cleaning it all up yet, because I dove into this today. But I think everything's straightforward from a design perspective and pulling historic out up until there. But if you start just reading through like the storefront spandrels and the cornices and pediments, it reads more like historic preservation requirements. Restoration, all those and I think those need to probably be rewritten as design guidelines versus historic preservation guidelines. And it's not so easy as just striking it. But if you want, I might be able to take a stab, because as I was reading through it, I just knew that we haven't lost the push for historic here, like we have earlier.
I'd rather have you do it than me do it.
Okay.
He's too expensive.
I have no idea what I'm doing.
I won't charge you my rate. If you buy some fudge and some other sweets and stuff, we'll call you. Yeah, I'll take a look at it.
I'll buy 2 pounds of fudge.
What's that?
I'll buy 2
2
pounds
pounds
of
of
fudge.
fudge, there we go. I'll take a look at it, and there's some of these I think we might just be able to lose, because I in the industry was confused, like the one that says W shop fronts. Shop fronts should fit inside the original shop front in terms of all 3 dimensions, and I was trying to figure out what that actually meant, and I'm at a loss, and so if I can't figure it out, I figure we might as well take it out. Because I'm guessing you guys probably don't know what that means either.
Not in the context of it.
Okay, so I'll go through it, and things that either don't make sense, or would be hard to interpret for a planning commission, or if they're more historic concerns, like historic materials versus a design quality, I'll try to massage that.
Do you have this document as a Word file?
I might be able to pull it down, but I haven't yet.
Well, we can certainly provide that to you as a Word file. My thought would be to get you a clean draft of the most updated draft.
Okay.
So that you can go in and revise that section,
Okay.
and then we can,
Just redline it or whatever.
yeah, we can do a
Yeah.
comparison.
Because
then.
I think there's design guidelines as relates to windows that don't have to get into, you have to preserve the original window kind of stuff. So. All right.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Anybody else have any thoughts or comments to follow up on? Okay,
I do.
okay.
Just trying to figure out where we are. So, on the big question that we talked about, I still don't have a definitive, clear direction with respect to how you want to handle demolition. So I don't know if you want to try and resolve that tonight or not.
Well, I think you and I were talking,
Yeah.
keep demolition in, but see if we can figure out a way that actually works from a legal and a municipal perspective of putting the emphasis on requiring something to come next and the quality of whatever comes next, versus having all the checks and balances on the front end in terms of you can't demolish unless you meet these criteria.
And is something next, is it acceptable, to have, including, say, a vacant lot with appropriate landscaping? Is that an acceptable something next?
It's not my, I think I'd have to go back and look at the boundaries of the district, but I think for the majority of the boundaries of the district, I think that's probably not, for the majority of the cases, not going to be acceptable to have a vacant lot with landscaping. It would have to be a building.
Does everyone agree with that? I mean, I don't want to start work on this without clear consensus.
I think it depends. It depends on what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Well, maybe what you can do is if you still have the slides, or we can resend them, just kind of go up and down Main Street and look at the different examples and say to yourself, what will that look like if we allow it to be a vacant lot? Or what will it look like if they're required to put up a new building? I mean, if you're a visual type person, that's one way of going about it.
Yeah.
If it's a philosophy thing, then you just need to be able to share, what your feelings are about that and why you feel that way, so we can make sure that, we can capture that in whatever draft we bring at the next meeting.
I'm personally pretty comfortable to say I'd want a building, just because if we're talking demolition, it's because there's a building there now. And so if the building is there now and a building's coming down, then not having a building is going to decrease the density downtown, it's going to decrease setback. I mean, most downtowns you're looking for high density, zero setback, infill,
Okay, so
all those kinds of
let me
things.
just take you guys through this, then. We'll need to figure this out.
Yeah.
If we're going to say buildings can come down, but we need a plan to replace them, and we need you to, do we just need a plan, or do we actually need an enforceable process to make sure that they replace them? And are we willing to go so far as to say that if you don't perform and replace the building, you're going to have to post financial security with us so that we can go in and build it ourselves? How far do you want to go with this? That's the logical question.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example. We have agreements now with, for example, landowners who are required to maintain stormwater management facilities. And we have agreements with them that say, if you fail to do this, we will go in and we will do it for you, and then we will charge you. I mean, is that what we're talking about here?
From our earlier conversations, the understanding that would be very difficult.
Yes.
Okay. So my gut reaction right now is that I think we've already got it written as requiring a development agreement. Okay, and I'm comfortable with that. I would like to add, though, that it's not just an agreement to develop. It's an agreement to develop a specific plan that's presented and has already been approved.
That's already in here.
Is that in there already?
Yeah, if you look at the standard for demolition, under at least B1, you have to, before you could get approval, you have to have a permit for construction of a new building or structure on the site before you can get approval to tear it down. So in other words, under B1, you have to show that your building is in real bad shape you've got a permit to replace it, you've got approval of a plan to replace it, and you've entered into an agreement to replace it. So I would take out the first part, which is it's in bad shape, and I would just say you've got approval to build a new one, and you've entered into an agreement to build a new one.
Okay.
Something like that. But again, the real tough question is, really? What are we gonna do with, if somebody is, you know, and right now, the definition of development agreement says it's a totally unsecured obligation. So if somebody fails to perform, then I suppose we're looking at suing someone for breach of contract and asking a judge to either order them to perform, and failing compliance with that order, to throw them in jail, because that's the alternative, or to pay us money damages, which I really don't see how we would prove what our damages are. So again, to me, it's pretty unusual to be trying to set that kind of a framework up. I've not seen it elsewhere.
Well, I'm more comfortable with items 3 and 4 under there than I am under the item 2, which, on the II.
Yeah.
I think the cost of repairing the building or structure would exceed 85%. One, I don't think that's the right math. But two, with the way state law is going now, that the burden of proof is on us, then it's essentially us having to prove. I mean, the examples I've seen from other communities that have like the proof of non-economic viability and all that kind of stuff, and what they're requiring applicants for demolition to come up with, I'm guessing all that stuff would be thrown out in the sense that they're going to say that the burden of proof is on us, that we essentially have to show that it's not. Or that it is economically
I'm not
viable.
ready to, I don't know that I can go there tonight, and we've already talked about, we're no longer putting the focus here on prove that it's okay to take down this building. Now we're talking about whether we're gonna require someone to replace the building.
Well, is there something that you see as being more viable than having them already received a permit for construction of a new building or structure on the site, that it's approved and that they've entered a development agreement? I mean, do you see things that are enforceable, that would take us down the path that we're looking at with those two? Or
Well, I'm not saying it's unenforceable. What I'm saying is that the question is whether that's the policy decision you want to recommend to the council, that be the standard, that we actually say, yes, you can tear down a building, but not unless you have approval to replace it, and that approval is backed up by a legally binding commitment to replace it,
Yeah.
and we're going the whole 9 yards to make sure that you follow through. That's the question.
let me ask this question of staff.
This is
As relates to that line that says a permit for construction of a new building or structure on the site has been approved and issued prior to or simultaneously. One, what I'm thinking of in my head is that if someone is actually not only going to pay for demolition, but they've already paid for a firm
A big investment.
to do a design, particularly a detailed design,
In order to get a
and
permit,
they're
you
probably certain, so how detailed do I mean,
need to
someone
have a
can't just
state-approved
come.
plan. You need a
So
state-approved
So you need a
building plan.
state-approved plan, so it has to be detailed construction documents?
Absolutely.
And you have to get through the structural project review
Okay.
process here.
Because if we're requiring, I mean, it's unclear in this wording that we're requiring detailed construction documents.
Well, there's a building permit.
Yeah.
A
Okay.
permit for construction.
Permit for construction.
You need a-
So that's implied.
There's a significant investment to get to
All
this
right.
step.
Because to me, once they've made that kind of investment in design, and now they've got something that they're having to, by not building, they're actually not building something that they've invested in designing and that they can see and they visualized, plus they have a development agreement. I'm more comfortable with that than, say, for example, if this was much more conceptual, that they've come to us, like some proposals that come to the commission for our approval, are, napkin sketches and they're conceptual, and then they're not necessarily construction documents. So I think that if this is that far, then
So the question then is,
yeah.
are you prepared to foreclose the possibility and the opportunity that someone could say, let me take down my building and leave it vacant for 6 months or a year or 2 years and not have to invest in that? I.e. the Kittlesons. They wouldn't be able to get approval to do what they now have approval to do under this revised framework. Is that okay with you guys?
It's okay with me.
Right.
It's okay with me.
But if they could say that, but they would have to have a plan
They'd have,
for 6 months or a year later to go ahead and do something.
They'd have to do it before they could demo it.
what we're talking about here is that before they could get approval to demo the building, they'd have to have an actual permit to build a new building, means complete plans and specifications approved, state-approved plans, plus project review approval, and maybe, I think, we're still talking about having a development agreement that says, so a contract saying you have to build it. So if that's what you want, that's how we'll do it. I'm just wanting to make sure we all understand that's what we're talking about.
I think that's what I heard, and I think that's what I also heard when I was on Landmarks, is, like I said earlier, we want to make it difficult for somebody to just tear down a building and they have a good reason to do so, and the good reason would be to put something as good or better than what they're removing. That didn't happen with the last one, and that was because, to me, the minimum maintenance standards weren't in place in order to enforce that. And if we fix that, the Landmarks goes through and they designate those buildings that qualify, that alone is going to make a lot of this go away, and then anything that's left over is probably going to be a big project. And on a bigger project, I think that they're going to commit the time and resources to have a replacement plan.
So do you want to get rid of 6B 2 and 3 then? And just have one, which is you get approval once you get a permit for a new building and you've entered into an agreement? Sorry.
If I could just add, I think I got my doubts about that in general, but I think it would be important to have a time limit. And,
Time
So-
limit for the replacement?
yes.
Yeah, that's,
And-
right now it's in here at 36 months.
Oh, okay. That would be good. And I think generally speaking, it would be okay if they went to all that expense and then were unable to do it. I don't see any reason we'd need protection against that, because obviously, if we approved it in the first place, we would feel that it was going to be an improvement to the city. So that would give us enough protection, I think, with a time limit. I didn't realize there was a time limit in there, but that would be important, or it could go on for a long
Yeah,
time.
and I would assume if they didn't complete it, there would be other circumstances, and if they were to sell that property, would that transfer to the new owner? So let's say they come to a plan, new owner takes it over, new owner says, yep, I want to follow through on it, or would they have to start the process all over again?
Well, you're entering into a development agreement with somebody.
Uh,
It seems like you'd transfer that to the,
Yeah.
if the project's good for one, why wouldn't it not be good for the next?
Yeah, and, there's only so much I want to put in here in terms of describing what the agreement's going to say, but, I mean, certainly that
That
would be my
the
expectation that
individual development agreement, you think? That's
well,
that
that's where it
language
would be addressed, and my expectation is that, yeah, you would indicate that it would be binding on successors and assigns.
I think that's about all we can do, because these buildings aren't going to last forever either.
Maybe unless an acceptable development agreement was approved by the city, or a comparable development. So they wouldn't have to do exactly what another guy wanted to do. That would be pretty prohibitive. But if
They would have to do that unless they got approval to do something different.
yes, from the city.
So back to, though, so it seems like the direction you're going is that the emphasis is no longer on making sure we protect existing buildings. So we don't have to worry about this the standard under 6B 2 doesn't seem to make sense anymore.
Yeah, I see your point. I think that could probably be struck for,
Unless you want to allow someone to demolish a building without having to agree to replace it under those
yeah,
circumstances.
this is where I think, number one, we're working at the same time on a maintenance ordinance, correct? So hopefully that'll take care of some of these issues. But isn't there somewhere else in this ordinance where it says if the building inspector says the building has to come down, then it can come, I mean, I thought there
Yeah,
was,
the raising,
Yeah, there's a provision in.
there's a provision in here that if,
there's a raising and there's a
Yep.
taking of the property.
If it's subject to a raise order, then this doesn't apply.
right, and so essentially, let's say that the Kittleson property, let's say that the building inspector came to the city and says, they're not gonna come to us with a development agreement, they're not gonna come up with a plan, but I, as building inspector, thinks that the building has to come down. Then I think you still have that option, that you won't have a blighted building sitting in the middle of the district that we can't do anything with. I mean, correct?
Well, so under the application of regulations, this section does not apply to a court-ordered raising, which is different from, this does apply to the building inspector. So
Okay.
if there's actually a court, and it's been a while since I looked at this, but there are different ways that you can end up with a raise order, one of which is a judicial process, and we came to the conclusion that we can't, that would preempt any city ordinance to the
Right.
contrary. But we think, I came to the conclusion that we could subject the city building inspector to this process. So, in other words, if the building inspector, without going through a judicial process, wanted to issue a raise order, he'd have to come here first.
Okay. But then there would be no option, if you took 2 out, then there'd be no option just to be able to address the building inspector's concerns if the property owner isn't planning to develop. So
Yeah, so 2 is there, yeah, if the building is deemed to be detrimental to or does not contribute to the architectural or aesthetic character of the district, do you want to allow somebody to come in and prove that and then just be able to tear it down without approval to build a new one and a development agreement and all that?
That's a tough one, because I mean, for example, the Kittleson request, they would have probably then submitted under 2.
I would think so.
And we
That's where they would have come in. They would have, if we let 2 in. They would have said, this building does not contribute to the district. It is in fact detrimental to it. Let me take it down.
Any more thoughts, or you guys had enough for one night?
Yes.
Or 2 nights, or 6 nights of this? It's been a long haul. I think we're making progress, but I've said that before and we're still not there. So we'll do some work internally. If you guys have any thoughts, I know Todd said he did, you can pass them our way. And we'll try to bring something at the next one, and we'll keep trying until we get it done, but I think we're getting there. You know, we knew going into this is going to be a very difficult process, and we've proven that to be correct.
But that said, I think it's much better than
Getting closer, right?
yeah, it's much better than it was.
Yeah. Okay, is there any future agenda items that anybody else wants to? Otherwise, I'm sure things just naturally come to us, and we'll put them on the next agenda. So I'm looking for a motion to
Move to adjourn.
I heard a motion.
Second.
And a second? Did you catch that? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None opposed? Thank you.